The Galactic Council's decree echoed across the stars, carried by the cold, mechanical voice of their emissary. It was a message of finality, a death knell for progress. By the authority of the Galactic Council, all artificial intelligence and cybernetic enhancements are hereby banned. Any species found in violation will face immediate sanctions up to and including military intervention. The holographic projection flickered in the center of Earth's United Nations chamber, casting an eerie glow on the faces of humanity's leaders. The emissary, a towering alien clad in shimmering robes, loomed over them like a judge pronouncing a sentence. Its eyes, cold and unfeeling, scanned the room as if daring anyone to object. No one did. Not yet. The emissary continued, its voice dripping with disdain. Your species' reliance on machines is an abomination. You have strayed from the natural order, and for that, you must be corrected. In the back of the room, Commander Kill Draven clenched his fists. His augmented arm whirred softly, a reminder of the technology the Council now sought to destroy. He was a living testament to humanity's progress, a fusion of flesh and machine, stronger, faster, and smarter than any unaugmented being. And yet, as he listened to the emissary's words, he couldn't help but feel a pang of doubt. Was he still human, or had the machines made him something else? The emissary's hologram flickered again, and the room fell silent as it delivered its final warning. You have one lunar cycle to comply. Failure to do so will result in your species' isolation or eradication. The projection vanished, leaving the chamber in darkness. For a moment, no one spoke. Then the room erupted into chaos. Diplomats shouted, scientists argued, and military leaders barked orders. But amidst the noise, one voice rose above the rest. We will not comply. All eyes turned to President Elena Voss, her steely gaze cutting through the chaos. She stood at the head of the room, her hands resting on the podium. Her voice was calm but firm, carrying the weight of a decision that would shape humanity's future. We will not dismantle what we have built. We will not abandon our progress, and we will not bow to the tyranny of fear. The room fell silent once more, the weight of her words settling over them like a storm cloud. Kale felt a surge of pride, but it was tempered by the realization of what was to come. The Council would not take this lightly. They would come, and they would bring war. As the meeting adjourned, Kale approached the president. You know what this means, he said, his voice low. They'll hit us hard. Elena nodded, her expression grim. I know, but if we back down now, we lose everything. Our freedom, our future, our humanity. Kale hesitated, then nodded. Then we fight. We fight, Elena agreed, but not just for survival, for the right to exist as we are. As Kale left the chamber, his mind raced. The Council's fleets would be here soon, and humanity was far from ready. But they had something the Council didn't: ingenuity, adaptability, and a will to survive that no machine could replicate. And perhaps, just perhaps, that would be enough. The training facility was alive with the hum of machinery and the rhythmic clang of metal on metal. Rows of augmented soldiers moved in perfect unison, their cybernetic limbs gleaming under the harsh fluorescent lights. At the center of it all stood Commander Kale Draven, his augmented arm whirring softly as he adjusted the settings on a holographic training program. His sharp eyes scanned the room, noting every detail, every flaw in their movements. Again, he barked, his voice cutting through the noise. The soldiers obeyed without hesitation, their movements precise and calculated. They were the best of the best, each one a fusion of human ingenuity and machine precision. But Kale knew that even they weren't ready for what was coming. Draven, a voice called from behind him. Kale turned to see Dr. Mira Kelso, the lead scientist behind the Vanguard Corps' augmentation program. Her lab coat was stained with grease, and her hair was tied back in a messy bun, but her eyes were sharp and focused. Mira, Kale greeted her with a nod. What's the status on the new recruits? Promising, she replied, pulling up a holographic display of their vitals. But they're not ready for combat, not yet. Kale frowned. We don't have the luxury of time. The Council's fleets will be here soon, and we need every soldier we can get. Mira hesitated, then lowered her voice. There's something else. I've been analyzing the Council's transmissions. They're not just coming to enforce the ban. They're coming to erase us. Kale's eyes narrowed. They're afraid of us, Mira explained. Not just our technology, but what we represent. Progress, evolution. They see us as a threat to their power, and they'll do whatever it takes to eliminate us. Kale clenched his fists, his augmented arm whirring louder. Then we'll show them just how much of a threat we can be. Before Mira could respond, the facility's alarms blared to life. The holographic displays flickered, replaced by a live feed from Earth's orbital defense network. The Council's fleet had arrived, hundreds of ships, their sleek, angular designs a stark contrast to humanity's more utilitarian vessels. All units report to your stations, Kale ordered, his voice calm but commanding. The soldiers moved with practiced efficiency, their cybernetic enhancements allowing them to react faster than any unaugmented human could. As Kale made his way to the command center, he was joined by Lieutenant Jackson Reed, his second-in-command. Jackson was a stark contrast to Kale, younger, more impulsive, but no less skilled. His cybernetic eye glowed faintly as he scanned the incoming data. "They're not wasting any time," Jackson remarked, his tone grim. "Looks like they're heading straight for the orbital defense platforms." "Then we'll meet them there," Kale replied. "Get the fleet ready. We'll hit them before they can establish a foothold." Jackson nodded and relayed the orders, but as they entered the command center, Kale couldn't shake the feeling of unease that had settled in his gut. The Council's fleet was massive. Their technology advanced beyond anything humanity had ever faced. And yet, as he looked around at the augmented soldiers and sentient warships under his command, he felt a flicker of hope. "This is it," he said, addressing the room. "This is what we've trained for, what we've sacrificed for. They think we're weak. They think we're afraid. But they're wrong. We are the vanguard. We are humanity's future. And we will not fall." The room erupted into cheers, but Kale's mind was already racing ahead. The battle would be brutal, and the cost would be high. But if they could hold the line, if they could prove that humanity was more than just flesh and bone, then maybe, just maybe, they could turn the tide. As the fleet launched into orbit, Kale took a moment to steel himself. This was more than just a battle. It was a statement, a declaration that humanity would not be cowed, that they would not be erased. And as the first shots were fired, lighting up the void of space with bursts of energy and fire, Kale knew one thing for certain. The monsters they feared were here. The void of space was alive with the crackle of energy weapons and the silent bursts of explosions. The Council's fleet loomed like a swarm of predatory insects, their sleek, angular ships cutting through the darkness with terrifying precision. Humanity's fleet, a mix of sentient warships and augmented pilots, moved to intercept, their movements sharp and calculated. Commander Kale Draven stood on the bridge of the Eclipse, humanity's flagship. His augmented arm was linked to the ship's systems, allowing him to feel every pulse of its engines, every tremor of its hull. Beside him, Lieutenant Jackson Reed monitored the tactical display, his cybernetic eye flickering as it processed the incoming data. "They're forming up for an assault on the orbital platforms," Jackson reported, his voice tense. "If they take those out, we'll be wide open." "Then we don't let them take them," Kale replied, his voice steady. "Order the Aegis and Valkyrie to flank their lead ship. We'll hit them from both sides." Jackson nodded and relayed the orders. But as the ships moved into position, something unexpected happened. The Council's lead ship, a massive dreadnought bristling with weapons, suddenly changed course. Instead of heading for the orbital platforms, it veered toward the Eclipse. "They're targeting us," Jackson said, his voice rising. "They know who's in command." Kale's eyes narrowed. "Then let's give them a show. All hands, prepare for evasive maneuvers, and get me aligned to the Aegis." The Eclipse shuddered as it banked sharply, narrowly avoiding a barrage of plasma fire. The Council's dreadnought loomed closer, its weapons glowing with deadly intent. But before it could fire again, the Aegis and Valkyrie struck, their combined firepower tearing into the dreadnought's shields. Their shields are down, Jackson shouted. Now's our chance. Fire everything we've got, Kale ordered. The Eclipse's weapons roared to life, unleashing a torrent of energy that ripped through the dreadnought's hull. For a moment, it seemed as though the battle might turn in humanity's favor. But then something strange happened. The dreadnought's wreckage began to shift and reform, its shattered pieces coming together as if guided by an unseen hand. Before anyone could react, the ship had transformed into something else entirely, a massive, spider-like construct that moved with terrifying speed. "What the hell is that?" Jackson exclaimed, his voice filled with disbelief. "A trap," Kale muttered, his mind racing. "They knew we'd target the lead ship. They wanted us to." The spider construct lunged toward the Eclipse, its claw-like appendages tearing through the ship's hull. Alarms blared as the bridge shook violently, and Kale felt a sharp pain in his side as he was thrown against the console. "We're losing power," Jackson shouted. "We need to fall back." "No," Kale said through gritted teeth. "If we fall back now, we lose the orbital platforms, and if we lose those, we lose Earth." He activated his comlink, his voice cutting through the chaos. "All units, focus your fire on that construct. We need to take it down now." The fleet obeyed, their weapons converging on the spider construct. But it was fast, too fast, and its movements were unpredictable. It darted between ships, tearing through them with ease. The Valkyrie was the next to fall, its hull ripped apart by the construct's claws. "We're not going to make it," Jackson said, his voice filled with despair. But Kale wasn't ready to give up. Not yet. He activated his personal comlink, connecting directly to Elysium, the sentient AI that served as the Eclipse's core. "Elysium, I need you to do something for me," he said, his voice calm but urgent. "What do you require, Commander?" Elysium's voice was smooth and melodic, a stark contrast to the chaos around them. "I need you to override the safety protocols on the Eclipse's engines. We're going to ram that thing." There was a brief pause, and for a moment Kale thought Elysium might refuse. But then the AI responded, its voice filled with determination. "Understood, Commander? It has been an honor." The Eclipse's engines roared to life, their power surging far beyond their designed limits. The ship shot forward, its hull groaning under the strain. The spider construct turned to face them, its claws raised, but it was too late. The Eclipse slammed into it with the force of a meteor, the impact tearing both ships apart. The bridge was filled with blinding light and deafening noise as the Eclipse was consumed by the explosion. Kale felt himself being thrown through the air, his vision fading as he lost consciousness. When he awoke, he was floating in the void, his suit's life support systems keeping him alive. Around him, the wreckage of the Eclipse and the spider construct drifted silently, a testament to the cost of their victory. "Kale, can you hear me?" Jackson's voice crackled over the comlink, filled with relief. "I'm here," Kale replied, his voice weak but steady. "What's the status of the fleet?" "We lost a lot of ships," Jackson said, his tone grim. "But we held the line. The orbital platforms are still intact." Kale allowed himself a small smile. They had won the battle, but the war was far from over. And as he looked out at the wreckage of the Eclipse, he knew one thing for certain. The Council had underestimated humanity, and that was a mistake they would not make again. The medical bay was quiet, save for the soft hum of machines and the occasional beep of a monitor. Commander Kale Draven lay on a cot, his body bruised and battered but alive. His augmented arm, damaged in the battle, was being repaired by a team of engineers. Across the room, Lieutenant Jackson Reed paced nervously, his cybernetic eye flickering as he processed the events of the battle. "You should be resting," Kale said, his voice weak but firm. "Resting?" Jackson snapped, his tone filled with frustration. "We just lost half our fleet, and you want me to rest?" "We held the line," Kale replied, his voice calm. "That's what matters." "For now," Jackson muttered, "but what happens when they come back? And they will come back." Before Kale could respond, the door slid open, and Dr. Mira Kelso entered, her expression grim. She carried a datapad in one hand, and her eyes were filled with a mixture of fear and determination. "We need to talk," she said, her voice low. "Alone." Kale nodded and dismissed the engineers. Once they were gone, Mira activated the datapad, projecting a holographic image of the spider construct that had nearly destroyed the eclipse. "I've been analyzing the wreckage," she explained, "and I found something disturbing. More disturbing than a ship that turns into a giant space spider?" Jackson asked, his tone sarcastic. Mira ignored him and zoomed in on the construct's core. "This isn't just a weapon, it's a prototype, and it's powered by the same technology the Council banned." Kale's eyes narrowed. "You're saying they're using the very thing they accused us of abusing?" "Exactly," Mira replied. "They've been experimenting with AI and cybernetics in secret. The Great Collapse they keep talking about, it wasn't caused by rogue AI, it was caused by their own experiments going wrong." Jackson let out a low whistle. "So they banned the tech to cover their own mistakes and keep everyone else from catching up. And now they're using it against us," Kale said, his voice filled with anger. "They're hypocrites." "Worse than that," Mira said, her tone grave. "They're desperate. If they're willing to break their own laws, it means they're afraid of us." Kale clenched his fists, his augmented arm whirring softly. "Then we need to expose them. If the other species in the galaxy find out the truth, they'll turn against the Council." "It's not that simple," Mira replied. "The Council controls the flow of information. They'll just deny everything and paint us as liars." "Then we need proof," Jackson said. "Something they can't deny." Mira hesitated, then activated another hologram. This one showed a star chart with a single system highlighted in red. "There's a research station in the Zeta-9 system. It's heavily guarded, but if we can infiltrate it, we might find the evidence we need." Kale studied the hologram, his mind racing. "It's a suicide mission," he said finally. "But if we succeed, it could turn the tide of the war." "And if we fail?" Jackson asked. "Then we die knowing we tried," Kale replied. "But we're not going to fail." The room fell silent as the weight of the decision settled over them. Finally, Jackson nodded. "All right, let's do it." Mira looked at Kale, her expression filled with concern. "You're still recovering. Are you sure you're up for this?" "I don't have a choice," Kale replied. "This is bigger than me, bigger than all of us." As they prepared for the mission, Kale couldn't shake the feeling of unease that had settled in his gut. The Council's secrets ran deep, and he knew they would do whatever it took to protect them. But if they could expose the truth, if they could show the galaxy what the Council really was, then maybe, just maybe, they could turn the tide. And as the Eclipse's replacement, the Dawnbreaker, launched into the void, Kale knew one thing for certain. The monsters they feared were not the ones they thought. The Dawnbreaker slipped through the void like a shadow, its cloaking systems rendering it invisible to the Council's sensors. Inside, Commander Kale Draven and his team prepared for the mission ahead. The Zeta-9 research station loomed in the distance, a sprawling complex of gleaming metal and pulsating energy. It was a fortress, heavily guarded and bristling with defenses. Kale stood in the briefing room, his augmented arm now fully repaired, and addressed the team. Lieutenant Jackson Reed, Dr. Mira Kelso, and a handful of elite augmented soldiers listened intently. "This is it," Kale began, his voice steady. "The Council's secrets are in there. If we can retrieve the data, we can expose them for the hypocrites they are. But this won't be easy. The station is crawling with guards, automated defenses, and who knows what else. Stick to the plan, watch each other's backs, and remember, this isn't just about us, it's about the future of humanity." Jackson smirked, his cybernetic eye glowing faintly. "So no pressure, right?" "None at all," Kale replied dryly. "Mira, you'll be our guide. You know the layout. Jackson, you're with me. The rest of you, cover our 6. Let's move." The team moved swiftly through the Dawnbreaker's corridors, their movements silent and precise. As they approached the airlock, Mira handed Kale a small device, a data spike designed to bypass the station's security systems. "This should get us in," she said, "but once we're inside, we'll have to move fast. The Council's AI will detect the breach within minutes." Then we'll make those minutes count, Cale replied, attaching the spike to his belt. The airlock hissed open, and the team launched themselves toward the station, their magnetic boots latching onto its hull. Cale led the way, his augmented arm interfacing with the station's systems to disable the outer defenses. The data spike whirred to life, and with a soft click, the access panel slid open. "We're in," Cale whispered, signaling the team to follow. Inside, the station was eerily quiet, the only sound the faint hum of machinery. The walls were lined with holographic displays, their alien script scrolling endlessly. Mira quickly deciphered the symbols, guiding the team toward the central data core. "This way," she said, her voice barely audible. "But stay sharp. The Council doesn't leave places like this unguarded." As if on cue, a squad of robotic sentinels rounded the corner, their glowing optics scanning the area. The team froze, pressing themselves against the walls. Cale held up a hand, signaling them to wait. The sentinels passed by without noticing them, their mechanical footsteps fading into the distance. "Too close," Jackson muttered. "Keep moving," Cale ordered. They reached the data core without further incident, but as Mira began downloading the information, the station's alarms blared to life. Red lights flashed, and a robotic voice echoed through the corridors. "Unauthorized access detected, initiating lockdown." "They know we're here," Mira said, her fingers flying over the console. "I need more time." "We don't have time," Cale replied, drawing his weapon. "Jackson, cover the door. The rest of you, protect Mira." The team took up defensive positions as waves of robotic sentinels poured into the room. Cale and Jackson fought side by side, their augmented abilities giving them an edge. Cale's arm unleashed bursts of energy, while Jackson's cybernetic eye targeted weak points in the sentinel's armor. "How much longer?" Cale shouted over the noise. "Almost there," Mira replied, her voice strained. The sentinels kept coming, their numbers overwhelming. One of the soldiers went down, his cry of pain cut short as a sentinel's blade pierced his chest. Cale gritted his teeth, pushing back the guilt. They couldn't afford to lose focus. "Got it," Mira finally shouted, pulling the data spike from the console. "Let's go!" The team fought their way back to the airlock, their movements desperate but coordinated. As they reached the exit, Cale turned to Jackson. "Get them out of here. I'll hold them off." "Like hell you will," Jackson replied. "We're in this together, remember?" Cale hesitated, then nodded. "Then let's make it count." They unleashed a final barrage of fire, forcing the sentinels back long enough for the team to escape. As the Dawnbreaker detached from the station and sped away, Cale looked back at the glowing complex, his mind racing. They had the data, but at a cost. And as the station's defenses powered down, signaling its self-destruction, Cale knew one thing for certain. The Council's secrets were out, and the galaxy would never be the same. The Dawnbreaker hurtled through hyperspace, its engines straining as it put distance between itself and the Zeta-9 station. On board, the mood was tense. The team had retrieved the data, but the cost had been high. One of their own was dead, and the Council's forces were undoubtedly in pursuit. Commander Cale Draven sat in the command chair, his augmented arm interfacing with the ship's systems. The data spike containing the Council's secrets was clutched in his hand, its glowing core a symbol of hope and danger. "How long until we reach the rendezvous point?" Cale asked, his voice tight with urgency. 20 minutes, Lieutenant Jackson Reed replied, his cybernetic eye scanning the navigation console. "But we've got company. Council ships just dropped out of hyperspace behind us." Cale's jaw tightened. "Of course they did. Mira, how's the data?" Dr. Mira Kelso looked up from her workstation, her face pale but determined. "I've decrypted most of it. It's worse than we thought. The Council's been experimenting with AI and cybernetics for decades. They've created weapons, monstrosities that make that spider construct look like a toy. And they banned the tech to keep everyone else from catching up," Jackson muttered. "Typical." "We need to get this information to the rebel factions," Cale said. "If we can unite them against the Council, we might stand a chance." "If we survive that long," Jackson replied, his tone grim. "Those ships are gaining on us." The Dawnbreaker shuddered as a plasma blast grazed its hull. The Council's ships were fast, their sleek designs cutting through space like knives. Cale gripped the armrests of his chair, his mind racing. "Evasive maneuvers," he ordered, "and prepare the defense turrets. We're not going down without a fight." The ship banked sharply, narrowly avoiding another barrage of fire. The defense turrets roared to life, their energy beams slicing through the darkness. One of the Council's ships exploded in a burst of light, but the others pressed on, their weapons glowing with deadly intent. "They're targeting our engines," Jackson shouted. "If they take them out, we're dead in the water." "Then we don't let them," Cale replied, his voice calm but firm. "Mira, can you boost our shields?" "I can try," Mira said, her fingers flying over the console. "But it'll drain our power. We won't have much left for weapons." "Do it," Cale ordered. "We just need to hold them off long enough to reach the rendezvous." The shields flared to life, their energy absorbing the Council's attacks, but the strain was evident. The Dawnbreaker's systems were pushed to their limits. Alarms blared as the ship's power levels dropped dangerously low. "We're not going to make it," Jackson said, his voice filled with despair. "We don't have a choice," Cale replied. "We have to." As if in response to his words, a new ship appeared on the sensors, a massive, heavily armed vessel bearing the insignia of the rebel factions. It fired a volley of missiles at the Council's ships, forcing them to break off their pursuit. "It's the Iron Will," Jackson exclaimed, his voice filled with relief. "They're here." The Iron Will moved to shield the Dawnbreaker, its weapons unleashing a devastating barrage that tore through the Council's fleet. Within minutes, the enemy's ships were retreating, their hulls battered and broken. "This is Captain Rin of the Iron Will," a voice crackled over the comlink. "You've got some explaining to do, Draven." Cale allowed himself a small smile. "We've got the evidence, Rin. The Council's secrets. It's time to show the galaxy the truth." As the Dawnbreaker docked with the Iron Will, Cale felt a flicker of hope. They had survived, barely, but the real battle was just beginning. The Council would stop at nothing to protect their secrets, and humanity's fate hung in the balance. But as Cale looked at the data spike in his hand, he knew one thing for certain. The monsters they feared were about to be exposed. The Iron Will's hangar was a hive of activity as rebel soldiers and engineers worked to repair the Dawnbreaker. Commander Cale Draven stood at the center of it all, the data spike containing the Council's secrets clutched tightly in his hand. The weight of what they had uncovered pressed heavily on his shoulders, but there was no time to dwell on it. The Council's fleet was regrouping, and the rebels needed to act fast. Cale made his way to the command center, where Captain Rin, a grizzled veteran with a cybernetic arm of his own, was poring over a holographic star map. The room was filled with the hum of machinery and the low murmur of voices, but there was an undercurrent of tension that no one could ignore. "We've got a narrow window," Rin said, his voice gravelly but firm. "The Council's forces are scattered, but they'll regroup soon. If we're going to strike, it has to be now." Cale nodded, his mind racing. "We'll hit their command center on Zenthar Prime. If we can take it out, we'll cripple their operations and buy ourselves some time." "And what about the data?" Rin asked, his eyes narrowing. "If we're going to unite the galaxy against the Council, we need to get that information out there." "We will," Cale replied. "But first, we need to secure our position. If we move too soon, the Council will just bury the truth under a mountain of lies." As the plan was set into motion, Cale couldn't shake the feeling of unease that had settled in his gut. The stakes were higher than ever, and the line between ally and enemy was becoming increasingly blurred. He trusted Rin, but the rebels were a fractured coalition, and not everyone shared their vision of a free galaxy. The fleet launched into hyperspace, their ships cutting through the void with deadly precision. The journey to Zenthar Prime was tense. The silence on the bridge, broken only by the occasional beep of a console or the soft hum of the engines. Cale stood at the viewport, staring out at the swirling colors of hyperspace, his mind a whirlwind of thoughts. When they arrived at Zenthar Prime, the sight that greeted them was both awe-inspiring and terrifying. The planet was surrounded by a massive orbital defense grid, its surface dotted with sprawling cities and towering fortresses. The Council's command center was a monolithic structure that loomed over the landscape, its spires reaching toward the heavens. "This is it," Kale said, his voice steady. "All units, move into position. We hit them hard and fast." The battle was fierce, the rebels' ships engaging the Council's defenses in a deadly dance of fire and steel. Kale led the assault on the command center, his augmented soldiers cutting through the enemy with ruthless efficiency. But as they fought their way deeper into the complex, something felt off. "Kale," Dr. Mira Kelso's voice crackled over the comlink, her tone urgent. "I've been analyzing the Council's transmissions. There's something you need to see." Kale activated his datapad, his eyes narrowing as he read the information. The Council had known about their attack, and they had been waiting for them. "It's a trap," Kale muttered, his voice filled with disbelief. Fall back now." But it was too late. The doors to the command center slammed shut, trapping Kale and his team inside. The walls began to shift, revealing hidden turrets that opened fire without warning. The soldiers scrambled for cover, their cries of pain and anger echoing through the chamber. "Kill!" Lieutenant Jackson Reed shouted, his voice filled with panic. "We're surrounded." Kale's mind raced as he tried to make sense of the situation. How had the Council known? Who had betrayed them? As if in answer to his unspoken question, a familiar voice echoed through the chamber. "I'm sorry, Kale," Captain Rinn said, his holographic image appearing in the center of the room. "But the Council made me an offer I couldn't refuse." Kale's heart sank as the truth hit him like a punch to the gut. Rinn had betrayed them. He had sold them out to the Council in exchange for power and protection. "You bastard," Kale growled, his voice filled with rage. "You've doomed us all." "Maybe," Rinn replied, his tone cold and unfeeling. "But at least I'll survive." The hologram flickered and disappeared, leaving Kale and his team trapped and outnumbered. The turrets continued to fire, their energy beams cutting through the air with deadly precision. Kale knew they couldn't hold out much longer, but as he looked at the data spike in his hand, he felt a flicker of hope. The Council's secrets were still within their grasp, and if they could just survive long enough to get them out, they might still have a chance. "We're not done yet," Kale said, his voice filled with determination. "We fight to the end." The team rallied, their movements sharp and focused, as they fought back against the overwhelming odds. The battle was far from over, and the price of progress was higher than anyone had imagined. But as the turrets' fire intensified and the walls closed in, Kale knew one thing for certain: the monsters they feared were closer than ever. The command center was a war zone. Energy beams crisscrossed the air, carving through metal and flesh alike. Commander Kale Draven and his team were pinned down, their backs against a crumbling wall as the Council's turrets continued their relentless assault. The air was thick with smoke and the acrid smell of burning circuitry. Kale's augmented arm sparked, damaged in the chaos, but he refused to give up. The data spike, the key to exposing the Council's lies, was still in his hand. "We can't hold out much longer," Jackson Reed shouted, his cybernetic eye flickering as he fired back at the turrets. "We need a way out." "There is no way out," Kale replied, his voice grim. "But we're not done yet." He activated his comlink, his fingers trembling as he input a series of commands. The data spike glowed brighter, its core pulsing with energy. Kale had one last card to play. A fail-safe Mira had built into the device. If they couldn't escape, they could at least ensure the Council's secrets were exposed. "What are you doing?" Jackson asked, his voice filled with panic. "Buying the galaxy a future," Kale replied. "When I give the signal, run for the east exit. Don't look back." "Kale, that's an order," Kale barked, his voice cutting through the noise. Jackson hesitated, then nodded. "Understood." Kale took a deep breath, his mind racing. The turrets were closing in, their fire growing more accurate with every passing second. He waited for the perfect moment, then slammed the data spike into the floor. The device whirred to life, its energy surging through the command center's systems. "Now!" Kale shouted. The team sprinted for the exit, their movements fueled by desperation. Behind them, the data spike unleashed a massive electromagnetic pulse, frying the turrets and overloading the command center's systems. The walls shook, and the air was filled with the sound of collapsing metal. Kale stumbled, his injured arm slowing him down, but Jackson grabbed him and pulled him forward. "Keep moving," Jackson urged. They burst out of the command center just as the structure collapsed behind them, the ground trembling beneath their feet. The sky above was filled with the glow of explosions as the rebel fleet clashed with the Council's forces. The battle was far from over, but the tide was turning. "Kale," Dr. Mira Kelso's voice crackled over the comm link. "The data spike, it worked. The Council's secrets are broadcasting across the galaxy." Kale allowed himself a small smile. "Then we've done our job." But there was no time to celebrate. The Council's forces were regrouping, their ships descending toward the planet's surface. Kale and his team fought their way through the chaos, their movements sharp and focused. They had come too far to fail now. As they reached the rebel lines, they were met with a sight that filled them with hope. The Council's fleet was in disarray, their ships turning on each other as the truth of their leader's hypocrisy spread. The rebel forces pressed their advantage, their weapons cutting through the enemy with deadly precision. "This is it," Kale said, his voice filled with determination. "We end this now." The final battle was fierce, the air filled with the roar of engines and the crackle of energy weapons. Kale led the charge, his augmented arm sparking but still functional. The Council's forces fought with desperation, but their morale was shattered. The truth had been exposed, and their empire was crumbling. As the last of the Council's ships fell, the battlefield fell silent. The rebels had won, but the cost had been high. Kale looked out over the wreckage, his heart heavy with the weight of what they had lost and what they had gained. "We did it," Jackson said, his voice filled with awe. "We actually did it." "No," Kale replied, his tone somber. "We just gave the galaxy a chance to do it. The real work starts now." As the rebels began the long process of rebuilding, Kale knew that the road ahead would be difficult. The Council's fall had left a power vacuum, and not everyone would welcome the change. But for the first time in a long time, there was hope. And as Kale looked out at the stars, he knew one thing for certain. The monsters they feared were gone, and humanity, along with the rest of the galaxy, was finally free.